So just to quickly introduce Chris Sowton, if you don't know him. Chris's language teaching and training experience has been very wide and varied, including Vietnamese asylum seekers with learning disabilities, Cambridge PhD students, secondary school children in Nepal, ESOL students in East London, and Syrian refugee teachers in Lebanon. Now a freelance consultant, he works with a range of organisations focusing particularly on the projects which prioritise the emancipatory power of English in marginalised, especially refugee communities. He has also written several self-study books, teachers' books and course books, including being co-author of Unlock from Cambridge University Press. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Simon, and good afternoon to everybody from the UK, or good morning or good evening, depending whereabouts in the world you may be. I'm grateful that there's so many of you here today in September, which is the start of the school year in many places, the academic year. So thank you all for coming. So in the talk today, I will be looking at three main areas. So first of all, we'll be unpicking the title of what we actually mean by what we're going to look at here today. So critical thinking, integrating skills. What do we actually mean when we talk about these things? Then looking at some of the challenges of teaching critical thinking and 21st century skills and why it's hard, and hopefully maybe why there's so many of you here today to try and find out more about this. And then finally, some strategies for improving critical thinking in the classroom itself. So practical takeaway tips, hopefully, to make that more effective. So to start with then, to unpick the title. The reason for doing this is I think a lot of the words that we use to talk about critical thinking can often be misunderstood, or they have such a wide general meaning that they can end up meaning very little indeed. So first of all, this word embedding. I want to use this word straight from the beginning because I think it's such a crucial aspect of teaching critical thinking. Critical thinking is often taught as a standalone skill, as a subject, as a topic area, rather than an actual skill, seeing it as something embedded within good academic practice and as having a practical value for English language teaching. So I think critical thinking skills have to be embedded in what we do and not taught as something separate, as they often are. Then critical thinking itself. Again, one of these words that is almost ubiquitous in our field. You can't publish a new book, you can't run new courses without actually using this phrase, critical thinking. So what do we actually mean by that? And I think one of the challenges is that people have very different interpretations of what they mean. Having such a broad meaning can actually end up meaning that it has very little meaning indeed. To illustrate this, I'm just going to show a picture now. This may be a picture that is familiar to some of you, especially if you've ever studied philosophy or linguistics. And I'd just like you to take 10-15 seconds and write in the chat box what you see when you see this picture. So there it is. Please just add to the chat box, what do you see when you see this picture? Bird's head, a rabbit and a dog in one face, duck head, rabbit, bird and a rabbit, lots of ideas coming in. Yeah, so I think people seeing different things and also people using different descriptors in order to describe what they see. So some people using compound nouns, some people using different words, some people just seeing one thing or seeing linking it with an and or a but in between those two things. This is this image was one that was used by the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. And I think I use the phrase here, the critical thinking duck rabbit. I use it because I think when we talk about critical thinking, institutions, managers, teachers, learners, parents, publishers, they often will see critical thinking or understand it in very different ways. And that's not just between those different groups. It may be within those institutions, within a group of teachers, within a group of learners. They see it in those different ways. And it's a very ambiguous term. In the same way, people may see a duck or a rabbit or a duck rabbit or a rabbit duck. We use this word critical thinking all the time, but we may actually mean different things by it. And similarly, with this phrase 21st century skills, what do we actually mean when we talk about that? And again, it seems slightly strange. When I first started my ELT career, it was in the 20th century, and we're talking about 21st century skills sounded like a sensible thing, as a forward-looking thing, but we're now in 2019 and we're still using this phrase. And my concern is that, again, by using these very wide general terms, we don't actually really know what we are talking about. We need to be more specific. We need to disaggregate these terms in order to really say what we mean by that. What skills are we developing within the classroom? So this might be a fairly typical list of what we call 21st century skills, transferable skills, soft skills, critical thinking as being one of those core ones, but also flexibility, collaboration, social skills, initiative, etc., etc. I think it's much more useful to talk about these skills as in what they are, rather than just lumping them together as one general term. But my second question from that would be, how often do we actually see these skills on display within the classroom? I've had the opportunity and the privilege to work in many different countries, and often I think these skills are not shown within those classrooms. Not to generalize too much, but often we might find, the teacher starts a lesson, good morning, turn to page 78, or the homework, do this, don't use mobile phones. They're using communication skills, but in very restrictive pair practice. To what extent are we actually trying to develop these skills that we see here, if these are the practices which we're modeling in many classrooms? As I say, this is not to say this is what's happening in every classroom, but in many of the classrooms I have seen, do not allow students to actually develop those 21st century skills. They're in the textbook, but they are not in the practice of what we do as teachers. And this leads on to my final point from the title about classroom practice itself. Again, not wishing to generalize too much with attendees from so many different countries, but again, in my experience of, in China, in Lebanon, in Indonesia, in many, many countries, the classroom, in essence, aside from some technological changes, hasn't changed much in the last 100 years. Students still often sit by themselves at a desk, they listen to a teacher, there's a white or a blackboard involved. The actual structure of a classroom is very, very similar and hasn't changed a great deal. But if we look at some classrooms, then these ones are promoting 21st century skills there. In this example, students working in an island desk formation, so they're able to collaborate. It doesn't look like the teacher is in charge as much as in the previous picture, so students are allowed to show some initiative in terms of what they do. They're allowed to sit where they want. They're integrating digital technologies into what they are doing. So with a few small changes, it is possible to make the classrooms a better place for developing those 21st century skills. But so long as we still have models where students work in this kind of way, it's going to be very difficult to really push forward those 21st century skills. So moving on to thinking about some of the reasons for it, some of the challenges of teaching critical thinking and 21st century skills. So in this section, I'm going to refer to a critical thinking survey which Cambridge University Press did last year. And it was a very wide-ranging survey involving more than 1,000 teachers from 81 different countries. And some of the findings that came out of that were very interesting indeed. So, for example, nearly everybody agreed that it was important to develop students' critical thinking skills. So they very much see it as being a role of the English language teacher to help develop those critical thinking skills within the classroom. But only 20% agreed that academic English courses actually supported this. So while there was near universal agreement that they were important, only 1 in 5 felt that the courses that they were doing supported this. And a similar number only agreed that they had the materials to do this. Half said that they lacked the time to support critical thinking adequately, and only 17% reported having had specific training or coaching in critical thinking skills. So this was a real challenge, that there is an overwhelming agreement that this is a role of the English language teacher, but people don't have the support, the materials, and don't feel they have the time to do it well. So there's obviously an issue there. And there is at the bottom there is a link to that survey if you're interested in finding out more. I also put this quotation up here, which I think it's quite an interesting one. This was by a novice teacher teaching in an academic environment. And what she said is that I turned to more experienced colleagues for advice, a step which revealed that many of my colleagues felt equally unsure about or unable to explain to me what is meant by critical thinking, and also seemed to be unclear on how to guide their students in this, particularly in their own academic production. Again, linking back to some of the points I was mentioning before, that people have different perceptions of what critical thinking is, which is then conveyed in different ways to learners. But certainly if you are coming in as a teacher to academic teaching or other forms of teaching, it's a real challenge if you're then asked to teach critical thinking as well. And there is a further issue that if learners themselves are keen and interested to try and develop their own skills, and they look for particular materials to be able to support them in doing this, they're very difficult to find that kind of information. This is an example of from Amazon of a very popular critical thinking book. Again, I'll just read this out. If you develop your ability to analyze people's attempts to persuade so that you can accurately interpret what they are saying or writing and evaluate whether or not they, etc., etc. I won't carry on to the end of that statement, but as you can see here, this is a very complex, difficult form of English that is being used to explain critical thinking. So when learners face these challenges, they go off to try and do something themselves about it, the actual materials which are on offer may be very difficult for them to access well. Another example of a popular critical thinking book, Critical Thinking Skills for Dummies. Again, the chapters in part 4 are all about that, and where I take a good look at the key skills of informal logic, for example, the fallacies that many critical thinking experts wax long on. So again, here we have some very informal colloquial language, a good look at, wax long on. Again, if we're talking about students who are maybe B1 level, even lower potentially, sort of high A2 level, that they are worried about critical thinking, they have to learn about it. These are the materials which are available to them. It's going to be very difficult for them to develop those skills themselves. And the results of this, well, I think from a student's perspective, what you end up with are students who struggle to perform at their best in higher education. And this results in frustrations by academics. They wonder why they can't do those things, why they haven't been prepared properly for their bachelor's degrees or whatever it may be. So students are frustrated, and this then in turn frustrates those who teach them at a higher level. It also results in teachers who are demotivated. Because teachers are trying to do this, they may not have the knowledge, or they might find it frustrating to be able to do this. And then this can have a negative washback onto their own English language teaching. They feel they can't do it well, and this may affect other areas of their practice. And then more widely at a macro level, nations and an international community who are not benefiting from the added value which could be present. So you think some of these challenges which do exist there have those fairly wide-ranging challenges and knock-on effects. So let's have a look now at what this might mean in practice, and how we can actually look at the classroom and look at how we can improve the situation which is there. I think one of the challenges and one of the problems of critical thinking in the modern age, as it were, is still the power and influence of Benjamin Bloom. So I'm sure he is a name that many of you will be familiar with and have learnt in your own education. You know, Bloom was writing, though, maybe 50, 60 years ago. And when we talk about critical thinking, his name is still front and center of everything that happens. And I think for us as an industry to really move on, we need to reevaluate and reposition Bloom. It's not to say there is no value in what he says, because I think he does offer a useful framework and useful ideas for thinking about some of these issues. But I think for too long, he's been held up as the only source of authority on critical thinking. So this is Bloom's original taxonomy that he developed as a way of conceptualizing knowledge. And as I say, I'm sure this will be familiar to many of you. I think first and foremost, when you look at this taxonomy, what I think is that it presents a problem in terms of how it looks. It looks hierarchical. It looks like you start at knowledge, and then through working hard and learning lots, you manage to go up through comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, to arrive at evaluation at the top of the mountain, that it's a process from going from the bottom to the top. Now, that's certainly not what Bloom was meaning with his taxonomy, but it's certainly how it can appear to learners when they see it and when they're working with it. And I think the actual shape of that taxonomy can be problematic. And if we look at here, these are, I just took some examples from a teacher talk board at the University of Arkansas. And I think we can see this was recent sort of postings on this site. And I think here we can see how Bloom translates into real life and the real classroom. And these are comments by actual teachers. Are lots of your students freshmen? If so, many of your learning objectives may target the lower end of Bloom's skills. Getting too far up in the taxonomy could create frustration and unachievable goals. Are most of your students juniors and seniors? These advanced students should be able to master higher order learning objectives. Too many lower level objectives might cause boredom or apathy. So in this situation here, there are teachers who are making a division between those lower order and higher order skills, and almost seeing as if there is a link between cognitive and linguistic ability, rather than looking at how those different skills can work together in order to be effective for overall learning. So I think one of the values that we can look at with Bloom is how some people have reinterpreted or reevaluated Bloom in the modern age. So using those core ideas, but looking at them more generally. So here is one example here, that we can see those similar ideas, but they are embedded within each other. They are not progressing from the bottom to the top, but they are working within inside each other. And then having this dialogic element, as we can see on the side, this asking of questions, very much in that Socratic tradition, that idea of asking questions, posing questions that we can see here. So for remembrance, can the learner recall or remember the information? Or for analysing, can the learner distinguish between different parts? For creating, can the learner create a product of point of view? So we're posing those questions, and that can be useful not only for learners, but also for teachers as well. We're not presenting critical thinking as being this huge challenge and this difficult thing that you have to be really smart to be able to understand. We're asking regular, everyday classroom questions that can really translate into good practice. And I think linked to this, to try and demystify critical thinking, let's try and get students to think about how they're using critical thinking in their everyday lives. Because they sometimes come to the classroom and think, well, now I'm going to learn about critical thinking and I've never had any experience of this before. Whereas, you can ask them a simple question like, when they came here today and when they crossed a road, what did they do? Because there, for example, they're using lots of critical thinking skills at the same time. They're remembering what they did last time they crossed the road. They're applying that in reality. They're analyzing when there's a gap between the traffic and where is a good place to cross. So, for example, there, you're getting students to reflect on what critical thinking they do in their everyday lives, and then that can translate more directly into classroom practice. Here's another way of looking at Bloom as well here. So here there are all the separate cogs. Creation here is at the center of the process as the highest of the higher order skills, as it were. But all of those other skills are working together in order to generate that creation. So again, it's looking at Bloom, taking those core ideas, but really thinking, what are we doing with that? How are those skills working together? And here, Bloom's digital taxonomy. So again, what we're doing here is we're really thinking about our students. We're thinking about it from their perspective, empathizing with them. Many of our students will be digital natives. They've grown up with technology and it's embedded in everything that they do. So in order to develop their critical thinking skills, let's get them to think about how they use critical thinking when they are online. So again, here, lots of the words here will be very familiar to them. Certainly in many cases, these words may be more familiar to them than they are to you. So looking here at sort of words like advertising, discriminating, blogging, vlogging, podcasting, reframing, etc., etc. So all of these words, all of these doing words, these verbs, are showing how critical thinking works in practice. So I think the Bloom's digital taxonomy, especially if you're integrating the digital into your classroom, can be a very effective way to show the effectiveness of critical thinking. And this last re-envisioning of Bloom here is what we used when we developed Unlock. So again, it's using some of those same ideas that have come before. But what we're doing here is to try and use more classroom-friendly words in order to explain those different aspects of Bloom's taxonomy. So rather than using a word like analyze, which we're not quite sure maybe what it means, we can disaggregate that and really dig down to think, what does that mean in a classroom? What does that mean for a teacher? What does that mean for a learner? And those typical types of tasks that we will do. So that would be explain, contrast, examine, identify, investigate, categorize. Or if with evaluate, a word which some of your learners may not be familiar, but they will be much more familiar with things like decide between these two things, rate these 5 things in order, justify why you should do X rather than Y. So really thinking when we give those classroom tasks and use those classroom verbs, we are then linking it back to critical thinking skills. And the way in which we use this within Unlock, so this is an example from Unlock, from reading and writing, try to make it as clear as possible. I think too often with Bloom, the learning has sometimes been hidden or it's been kept precious. We haven't really explained it to students. So I think we need to democratize it much more. As I say, when I was the critical thinking editor across all 10 books of the Unlock series, this is something which we really tried to do. So if we just break this down a little bit, so at the top, we can see that all the critical thinking is for something specific. So in this example, compare and contrast the 2 shark species in the diagram. So there's a very specific task which we're asking the students to do with this critical thinking. Again, we're embedding it, as I said at the beginning of the webinar, we're embedding it in what they do and linking it to their English language practice. Then there's a box which explains what the particular sub-critical thinking skill is being looked at. So again, it's that useful takeaway information which the students can use and to reflect on at home and to apply when they are doing the particular task. Then if you look on the left-hand side, you'll see analyze there. So again, we're linking it explicitly to Bloom's taxonomy. So when they see this, they know what kind of task they are expected to do. And this may help learners because they might remember, well, in the last unit, we also did an analyze task. And what we did there was X, Y, and Z. So what we're doing is we're building their critical thinking skills over a longer period of time. And then the use of the Venn diagram. Again, we're using visual organizers, very simple visual organizers, but ones which can really have a big impact on their own practice. So this skill here, use your notes from exercise 3, complete the Venn diagram, etc., etc. So here is a direct practical skill which students can take away after their lesson and use. So when they next take notes, or when they next have to write a compare and contrast essay, that they're able to use that particular visual organizer themselves. So they're taking something beyond the book, which they can then integrate into their academic practice. Okay, so the second point, or the second idea for really embedding it in classroom practice is to bake critical thinking into ELT provision. So again, not teaching it as something standalone, but show how it can be used in practice. What I'd like to talk about here, which is something which helped to shape, again, some of the work that I did on Unlock, but which I think has a real impact on good classroom practice, is to look at the Cambridge Life Competencies Framework. Again, there's a link there if you'd like to have a look at that. So what the Life Competency Framework does, it looks at 6 particular areas. So creative thinking, critical thinking, learning to learn, communication, collaboration, social responsibilities, and looks at how those skills can be, those competencies can be developed within the classroom. So how ELT can be used to advance those particular competencies, and vice versa, how those competencies can be used in order to maximize English language acquisition. And if we break it down, we can see some of those specific things in practice. So for critical thinking, that would be understanding and analyzing links between ideas, evaluating ideas, arguments, and options, synthesizing ideas and information. So again, it's tied into Bloom's taxonomy. But then we look at some of the other things: participating in creative activity, taking control of own learning. Some of the other ones: managing conversations, listening respectfully, taking active roles, including leadership. So all of these 21st century skills that we've talked about are really embedded here, really drilled down to think about what do they actually mean? What would those skills look like in a classroom? And that makes it more effective both for learners to know what kind of skills they should be displaying, but also I think for teachers to be able to evaluate whether you are helping students develop those skills within your classrooms. So if we go again then to look at some of the work that I did on Unlock, so as well as being the critical thinking editor, I also wrote one of the books. We can see some of these competencies in action. And again, the idea with all of these aspects that we included within Unlock is very much bearing in mind one of those key findings from the critical thinking survey, which is about the lack of time that teachers have to deliver these skills. So it's not saying we want you to reinvent the wheel, we want you to spend hours and hours of extra time planning how you are going to teach or what you're going to teach. It's just making a few changes to really maximize the ability for students to develop critical thinking and other skills within what they do. So if we look here, for example, at creative thinking, it's really trying to get students to think more creatively. You know, here, for example, using a few general pictures in order to stimulate those discussions. So starting off with what they know, those sort of basic core factual elements. What are the names of the 8 planets in our solar system, but then asking more open questions to really allow students to show what they do know, what else is there in space. It's a really open-ended question. Some students will want to talk about what they already know on maths, asteroids, stars, etc., etc. But other students may be more creative in terms of what they're doing, talk about aliens or whatever it may be. So it's really allowing the students to have the opportunity to discuss what they are interested in and allowing that to happen, rather than always feeling there's a specific end point which we need to get to. It's allowing students to have the space in order to be able to do that and to speculate more, to try and move away from thinking that there's always one right answer to everything, and allowing for a more multiplicity of different perspectives. With critical thinking, again, here's another example just of one of those visual organizers. So, a fairly standard mind map here. So, but presenting this to students to allow them within the safe structure of the classroom to develop that skill and that understanding, so that when they go outside of that classroom, they're able to apply it themselves. So again, thinking of that relationship, that link between the classroom and the outside world, and how they can take that knowledge outside of the classroom. I think too often we sometimes think of language learning as something which only takes place within a classroom, and it's only for a specific purpose to pass exams or whatever it may be. But I think if we're really going to prepare our young people of today for the future, we need to think beyond that. How are they going to use those skills more widely? By 2050, a lot of people estimate that half the jobs that will be in existence in 2050 haven't even yet been invented. So we can't prepare our students for something specific. We need to prepare them by developing their overall skills so that they are able to deal with those changes that take place. Learning to learn. Again, we're giving them that model. It's a fairly standard sort of activity here, sort of note-taking activity. But what they can do is, once they've completed that note-taking activity, which is obviously going to develop their listening skills, they're then able to take that away, to look at that and say, that's a good series of notes, and not being afraid to talk about why is it a good series of notes, what is positive about that, and then how can they then use that within their own practice. Communication. Again, in a classroom situation, we're often, as teachers, we're very busy, time is precious, we have to teach many hours a week, and certainly I know I have been guilty in some situations of just saying to students, right, talk in pairs, and then not really paying much attention to what then goes on. But really what we need to try and do is to think, well, what skills do they need to be able to talk in pairs or in groups more effectively? So again, managing conversations here, it's not just about talking. It's not just about the volume of what they say. And I think sometimes we can measure our progress by how much people are saying rather than perhaps the quality of what they're saying. So again, here, teach them those skills. Turn-taking, a very, very important speaking skill in all languages. And then breaking that down. What are the sorts of skills that are found within that? So inviting someone else to speak, interrupting, continuing to speak, and then giving them the language to be able to do that effectively. So we're breaking it down for them, we're curating that information for them. And I think within this, task repetition is a hugely valuable thing to do, because often we ask students to do things which are cognitively difficult and linguistically difficult at the same time. And that's really, really hard to do. And I think it's no wonder sometimes that students shut down or aren't able to do that. So allowing them to say what they want to say first of all, whether that's in poor quality English or whether that's even potentially in their own language, in their mother tongue. And then after they've had that experience of thinking about something critically, they can then repeat the task and do it in English or in a better form of English. So allowing them to really think about what their position is on a particular subject, and then giving them the extra language to do it again and to do it more effectively. But I think sometimes we can shut students down and say, oh, my class can't think critically, or they're not able to do that. But it's not that. It's that we're asking them to do something which is really, really difficult. We're asking them to do something which is cognitively and linguistically difficult at the same time. Collaboration. So again, working together, how can they do that more effectively? So again, here, giving them those different stages so they can really follow that more clearly. So here, use the table, etc., make sure, use the language, treating the students like adults, give them that specific things that they have to do, let them follow a particular protocol, but we are giving them the responsibility. It's learner focused, it's learner centered, they're doing all the hard work, we can just guide them, but they need those clear instructions, they need those clear sort of points in the road that they need to be at in order to deliver that effectively. And then last one, I think the really important area, these social responsibilities. So again, that link between the classroom and the outside world. What are we looking at here? How do students link? What they learn in the classroom to what is going on outside? So again, here, the fairly standard, typical sort of ELT question: do photos like these make you feel interested in learning more about space exploration? Okay, but then the next question, much wider: who do you think pays for exploring space? So we're really taking outside of that classroom. So one is that fairly contained, typical speaking type question, but then we're going beyond that and thinking, what is the impact of that within society as a whole? And then the third area to talk about then is preparing teachers more effectively to support critical thinking in the classroom. And as we saw earlier, it was one of the real interesting pieces of feedback that came back that teachers themselves said, we don't feel comfortable teaching critical thinking skills, or we don't feel we've got the knowledge to do this effectively. And if you haven't got the knowledge to do something effectively, then often what you'll do is just go over it quickly or not do it properly, because you yourself as a teacher don't necessarily feel comfortable doing that. But sometimes all it takes is a very small change in order to maximize those aspects of critical thinking within the classroom. I just give this example here of using Likert scales. So, often we would use a 5-point scale like the one at the top in the classroom. And certainly in my experience, if you ask students to do an activity there, they will pick point 3, neither agree nor disagree. They'll sit in the middle. They won't necessarily take a position. Whereas just making a small change to a 4-point scale, where they have to adopt a position, even if it's only slightly agree or slightly disagree, but we are forcing them to make that sort of decision. I think even just a small change like that can be really effective. But thinking more generally about how teachers themselves can develop these skills. So in the, again, the second edition of Unlock, which I referred to before, one of the changes that we made there was to give teachers the support in terms of developing their own critical thinking skills. And what I did is to divide that into 6 different areas. So one is to be informed. Why are you teaching this particular aspect of critical thinking? Because that's going to be a question that students ask you. Why are we learning this? Why are we doing this? So here is giving 3 reasons why they are doing that. So you can go bang, bang, bang. This is why it's an important skill. Then being confident. How do you become confident teaching this particular aspect of critical thinking? And I think often the best way is to do a similar kind of task yourself. So you can then empathize with the students and go through that process yourself. And that will be a way that you can really understand what it's for and why it's an important skill. So again, here is an example of what teachers can do to be able to develop that skill. Then the next one is being ready. So what do I need to do to prepare for the classroom? What do I need to do? What is the actual protocol or procedures that I need to follow in order to teach this skill effectively? Then being flexible. So within critical thinking, it's important to differentiate as well, just in the same way that we would differentiate when we're teaching language. I think we need to differentiate when we're teaching critical thinking as well. So between small classes or large classes, or between different levels of cognitive ability within the group. And I think what's important there as well is not to link linguistic ability necessarily with cognitive ability. They are not one and the same thing. Someone might be a very good critical thinker, but poor at language, or vice versa. Or they might be strong at both, or they might be weak at both. I don't think we can say there's a correlation between those cognitive skills and those linguistic skills. And then the fifth and sixth ones, then, so being reflective. So after we've taught critical thinking, assessing whether we ourselves have done it as effectively as we can. Are there any changes that we would make? Or when we teach that again next time, what could or should we do differently? And that last point, being collaborative. And so talking to your colleagues about what you have done, whether they've got the ideas, whether something went well for them, whether something was a challenge for them. So being collaborative in developing critical thinking skills. And the last area just to talk about then is that institutional norms must also mirror classroom norms. And I think this can be a challenge sometimes between what we say in the classroom and what actually happens within our institutions themselves. I think it can be very confusing for students. Historically, I taught at the University of London for several years, English for academic purposes, and I think it can often be confusing for students when they arrive at university and they have an idea of what critical thinking is, or how it should look like, or what it can do, but then they may be confronted with things like, you know, the idea of a safe space, that an institution doesn't tolerate hate speech, harassment, violence, etc. The trigger warnings, which may be statements at the beginning of a lecture, which say to students they might find some things distressing. And also the idea of no platforming, a form of boycott where a person or organisation is denied the opportunity to speak. Now, I'm not taking a particular position on any of these things. What I am saying is that I think it can be really confusing for students when they come with an idea of what critical thinking is, that we have to explore these different ideas, we can say what we like, etc., etc. And then at the university that they're at, they may be confronted by a different set of information. This is just an example taken from University of Liverpool, a course that is run there about creativity and critical thinking, about devoted to generating and evaluating ideas to address the challenges, etc., etc. But in 2017, I think it was, it's a controversial figure in the UK, someone called Peter Hitchens, was asked to sign a free speech contract before talking at the university, which would sort of outline what he was going to say, which he refused to do. And he instead talked outside the university in a public place and said what he wanted to say. And I think, as we can see here, his argument was that why should he have to sign a free speech contract at a university, especially when the university itself is publicising these kind of courses about making critical judgments and generating new imaginative ideas, etc., etc. So I think there is sometimes a conflict between what universities say in terms of their subjects and then the reality of the situation. And I think this can be very confusing for many students. And the last point I make, I think this can often be seen at the departmental level as well. I use these phrases TTT versus DTT in staff meetings. Teacher talking time versus director talking time. And I like this quotation here, which is taken from a blog by Alex Wright. I have a suspicion that not all employers want their employees to be critical thinkers, or if they do not want them to be critical thinkers all of the time. And I think what we need to do to really successfully teach critical thinking and embed those skills within young people, we have to mirror those values in our classrooms, in our institutions. Otherwise, it's hypocrisy. We are telling them that critical thinking is important, that they should do all of these skills, but we're not mirroring them ourselves. So just that final summary there, those sort of 4 takeaway messages then for applying to the classroom: re-evaluating and repositioning Bloom, embedding critical thinking into ELT provision, preparing teachers more effectively to support that, and then mirroring institutional norms with classroom norms. So thank you very much for listening, and hopefully now I'll pass back to Simon, and he'll be able to pass on some of the questions that may have come up during the webinar. So thank you very much.
Excellent, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for that session, Chris. Now, if anyone has any questions, you can type them into the box. Let me just clicking on the right button. So yeah, please type them into the questions box, and then I can put a couple of points to Chris. I think there was a comment earlier on, just while we're waiting for some questions to come in. I think it was by Christine. She said, "What about, so it's sort of about backwards critical thinking, so that you and I think the point was that you just have a go at this, and then you sort of unpick it in the reverse." I think on your communication slide, you made the point of allowing students to have a go first, maybe even in their own language, and then you're giving them the help they need. But I quite like that as an idea, as an approach.
I think that's, just to say, I think that's a great idea. But I think too often people treat critical thinking with gloves on. They don't think you can just have a go at it there. And I think students and often teachers can be nervous about doing that. So I think that's a really good point. But as a teacher, you set the tone in your classroom. If you encourage your students to do that, then they'll follow your lead. So I think it's all about the teacher themselves saying, this is okay to do this. It's okay to make mistakes. And sometimes the students need to be given that permission almost.
Sure. I've got a question here from Iman, which is, what about encouraging students to express their own thoughts by speaking while they lack enough vocabulary to help? I guess that's looking at the lower level students.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we need to do is to separate linguistic and cognitive ability. I think it's too easy to say, or certainly something I've heard in many places, that my students can't do critical thinking because their language isn't good enough. To my mind, that's not right. We're not giving the right task if that's our feedback. So yeah, very much, I'm very supportive of allowing students to use their own language first and foremost to develop those ideas. And then what we can do is as teachers, is to give them the language to express those thoughts in English. But we need more scaffolding. We need to support them in doing that. We can't just expect them to do it, to do something difficult in another language immediately. There needs to be different levels and steps in that process.
Sure. Just looking down the questions here. I think somebody has asked about if they don't have the resources, could you recommend some resources to help CPD for teachers on critical thinking? I think you had some books or something in your slides, but is there anywhere teachers could go to find more resources on this?
I mean, yeah, there's obviously lots of resources out there. But again, I would say to that, I think rather than just going to get resources or materials, it's about changing practice, I think. And I don't necessarily think people need lots of materials and resources to do that. So it's something as simple as thinking, if I'm teaching critical thinking in a lesson, why am I doing this? What is the point of doing this? And then after you've done that teaching, how did it go? Could I have done anything better? And then looking at whether you're able to talk to colleagues or to discuss that with colleagues to share those ideas. So yeah, there are resources and stuff out there, but my own view is that it's about changing what we do first and foremost. And that's something that's more difficult I think it's easy to go and find stuff and to read about it, but I think what's more important is to actually change how we do it.
There's a couple of different areas to similar themes, actually. One I'll pick on here, this is just in general, not picking on anybody, is how do you avoid unpleasant discussions in the classroom, if with the students? Or I think there's another one about unconscious bias as well, which is obviously
Yeah.
part of this, and students from different nationalities.
Yeah, I mean, again, the first thing I would say, and I know it's not necessarily depending on the situation that people are in, the teaching environment, it may sometimes be difficult or even dangerous to talk about particular issues. But if it's not, if you are able to talk about those things, I would say don't be afraid of having unpleasant discussions. A lot can be learned from that. It's about how you as a teacher can manage those situations. So I would say don't be afraid of that. But if someone does come up with a controversial position on a particular subject, or a position which is different to what many of the other people in the class think, is don't automatically shut that person down. That person may be coming from a particular background or have particular ideas about that. Ask them to explain why they think what they think. Allow them that opportunity to express that. Then you can talk about it. You can pick it. Sorry.
Sorry, thank you. No, sorry, I thought you finished your point. I thought you'd finished. There's lots of good questions coming in. Actually, we've got a few more minutes left, so I'll just carry on with another one. Great question, actually, from Arma. How do we measure critical thinking in the classroom?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Put you on the spot there, but
yeah. Again, I would want to take maybe a step back and say, do we want to measure critical thinking? I think part of the problem of English language teaching in many places is that we feel we have to measure everything. Then there has to be a number at the end of it, and then it can be really reductive to how we understand the process of language acquisition. So I would want to move away from being able to just give a number or to say you're an excellent critical thinker. I think a better way to do that is to maybe to ask the students themselves, how do they feel as a critical thinker, or to say, how do they feel their thinking skills have developed over a period of time? So actually get the students themselves to do a piece of critical thinking about their own critical thinking. That sort of self-reflection itself is a really difficult skill to develop, but a really important skill to be able to do that. So again, I know it depends on the situation that people are in, but to move away from thinking we have to give a grade or a number to those skills, and to put it back to the students for them to assess themselves how they think they have done in that particular area.
Okay, another question here. Chris, you mentioned Socratic questioning earlier. This is from Stuart Anderson. I found this to be a very effective way of developing critical thinking in the classroom, but not many teachers have the confidence to use that technique. How do we help teachers develop that confidence? Do you want to again just briefly touch on what Socratic questioning is, and then how can we develop teachers' confidence in the classroom?
So Socratic question is essentially, so Socrates, the Greek philosopher, he got a reputation in Athens for being a difficult person because he kept on asking questions, and that was his way of arriving at what he considered to be truth. So it's that question answer, question answer, question answer. I think too often in the ELT classroom we might say do this task or talk about X. But we're not really asking them what they're doing it for, or there's no clear objective to doing that. So I think real insight and really good language learning comes out where people have different positions about things, or where they have to ask those different questions. So one way I've done it, for example, in the classroom, is at the end of the lesson is to put students in pairs, and then for them to ask each other questions about what they have learned in that lesson. So it might be, even if it's just a sort of, I don't know, a grammar lesson, for example, it might be, how do you use the present simple? And then the other student has to answer that question. and then the other student has an opportunity to ask their colleague. So it might be, what time words would we normally use when we use the present simple? So, you know, it can be used for language learning as well as a recap at the end of the lesson. But rather than just doing a sort of a general summary, it's saying to students, ask them difficult questions. Ask your colleague a difficult question that you don't think they can answer. So it really gets them to drill down and focus on the core of what was learned in that particular lesson. And I think students get that very quickly. It takes a bit of setting up, but once it's done, I think it can be a really effective tool for classroom learning.
Excellent, thank you. Just another question here. I'm just wondering how to ask this. It's along the lines of, how can we get every student of, let's say, different abilities to be running as per the target in accordance with critical thinking stages in Bloom's taxonomy? So I think it's kind of, obviously some students might be more intelligent than others, so how can we get everybody on the same page? How can we encourage that? But I guess that might come through the structure of, to have actually a structure to then think your thoughts through. What would you think about that, Chris?
Yeah, I think again, it's about setting the right task. I think, you know, in any situation, if the students aren't able to do a particular task, that's a problem with the task rather than the problem with the students. So it's about setting tasks which all students can do. But what you might have to do as a result of that is to grade other aspects of it. So it might be that, you know, in a class, if you've got different language abilities, that students with good language abilities can do that in English, but those who have weaker language abilities might do it in, you know, half their own language and half in English. You know, I think my personal view is we need to be more flexible in allowing those sorts of things to happen, because I think too often we get that silence in a classroom, or we think our students are bad critical thinkers because we just ask them to do something which is too difficult. So we need to really grade the task and to differentiate properly, and to take the time to differentiate properly, you know, to divide groups accordingly into, you know, whatever we think will work best for that particular task.
Excellent, thank you. Very final question. I think we're nearly out of time. One very last question from me, and then we'll wrap up. So, question here, it says, in my school, some teachers are overusing critical thinking through group work, pair work, daily, and for the whole time. Is this right? So, can you overuse critical thinking?
I suppose I would say probably not. I mean, to be honest, I think you know, good critical thinking is often just good classroom practice. You know, so for some of those things that were just discussed are just good aspects of English language teaching. So I mean, I think what's important to maybe say, and maybe what that person is meaning, is that first and foremost we are English language teachers. And critical thinking is a component of that. We're not critical thinking teachers who then also teach English language. But critical thinking really can play a positive role in advancing good English language learning. So I think, yeah, that's just something we need to recognise. So obviously, I don't know if they're using it too much, but I think, you know, good critical thinking is often the same as just good pedagogy.
Excellent. It is 4 o'clock my time here in Cambridge, so we'll let Chris have a cup of tea now. So that's all we've got time for today. So thank you very much for that, Chris. Lots of great comments coming through, lots of great questions, and a lot of attendees today. Really pleased with that, and I'm glad you liked it. There's one thing I'd like to, while everyone's still on the line, if you're English academic teacher, we have an academic ELT online conference that Cambridge are running between the 29th of October and the 31st of October. This is a series of free online webinars, just like the one you've attended today, designed for teachers of academic English. Topics include critical thinking, vocabulary and speaking, listening skills, plagiarism, and much more as well. We're just pasting in a direct link to that now. Alternatively, you can just go to cambridge.org/academic-english, but a link is being pasted, so you can have a look what that's all about, and you can register for that as well. I think there are 8 talks over a series of 3 days at various times, so you'll be able to choose which talks you'd like to go to. So I encourage you to register for those. And then just finally, a question we always have is about certificates of attendance. So you will be able to reiterate what I said at the start. You'll be able to download a certificate of attendance for the webinar today with a link that will be sent to you in an email. And you'll get that along with the recording of today's webinar, and that will be sent in roughly 1 week's time. So thank you very much for attending. And again, thanks to Chris. Bye-bye.